Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you as always this Thursday that we do our recordings. Well, we don't actually do the recordings on Thursday, we do them any day, but they get released on a Thursday. Anyway, waffle to one side. Today's podcast is a little bit of a look of data quality. Now, I've got a couple of lacers with me who are going to have a chat. They're from our People and Workforce Analytics team, our practice, and we're going to focus in because we've done an interesting blog that's recently been written and launched, and we just thought we'd do a bit of a follow-up, so maybe we could put a little bit more colour on some of the discussion that we were having. But I will introduce the guests today. It's the wonderful Becki, Lovelady. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Are you looking forward to this?
Oh, yeah.
Love it. And Nancy Allen, who joins us as well. Nancy, right?
I'm good, thank you.
So, as is my new tradition, which I randomly introduced at the beginning of this year, we need to do a little bit of a check-in with a fundamentally different question. So before we get talking about the data quality piece that you guys have written, I want to ask you a little something about tooth fairies. I read an article recently about how the price of the tooth fairy, or the gift that the tooth fairy is donating, has risen quite dramatically since 2001. So in 2001, the average price, apparently from an organisation, I think they're called Dental Care in the US, had said that the average price of a gift, or the average gift that was received from a child, would be $2. In 2023, they did this analysis and it was $6. And I read one story about a mother that was based in the UK, and she gave her daughter, on receipt of one of her teeth that was put underneath the pillow, £60, a letter, a fairy necklace, and a Louis Vuitton bracelet, which, frankly, if I think back to my childhood, was never going to be something that I'd get in a million years. But the fundamentally different question today, and I'll start with you, Becki, if you could have any kind of gift from the tooth fairy under your pillow, and keep it realistic, because you said beforehand, just before we went live, what about a phone? You can't be realistic. What would you pick?
Well, I'd be worried if my teeth were falling out for starters, so I'm hoping it doesn't happen. And it's a little bit shallow, but I've always wanted a classic Chanel handbag. And they're incredibly expensive. They're not like, just you can nip down to the shop and get one, and they're ridiculous, but they are an investment piece. So I would love maybe just the side of my pillow rather than squashed underneath my head. But classic black Chanel handbag.
Nice.
That'd be nice if you're offering, if that's going.
Well, it's not either of us going to have to talk to the tooth fairy, but as you said, maybe not losing a teeth. No. There's a bit of weighing up to be done. Nancy, what are you going for?
I think I was lucky to get 50p on the child losing my teeth. I'll go equally extravagant and say Michelin star restaurant voucher.
Oh, very nice. And I think probably easy to fit it underneath the pillow. Exactly. Right. So let's talk about data quality. You guys have recently written a piece on the Lace Partners website, and it's all around some of the things that you need to think about, because it's quite an important area, isn't it, for HR professionals dealing with people data, very sensitive stuff. So before we go into that, though, we might want to do a credential check or a check-in as to who you are. Becki, can you tell our lovely listeners a little bit about yourself, and then Nancy, if you can jump in.
Yeah, of course. So I've been with Lace Partners for coming up to a year, probably about 8-9 months now. I joined as a senior consultant, specialising, as you said, in people workforce analytics. My background has always been in the world of analytics. It's my sort of passion, as I'm sure Nancy will say the same, but sad as it sounds, it is something we love. But I've always kind of been in-house roles, so I've worked within retail sectors, within higher education, within local government, always focusing on that data. So I always say that people data is people data, regardless of which sector or kind of how you're interpreting it. HR is no different to me. It's all about getting the most out of that data so you can make real data-driven insights. You can really kind of fundamentally make those strategic decisions. So that's my background. It's what I'm passionate about. And I'm really pleased to be here to talk about this today.
Cool. Nancy.
I've got a very similar background to Becki. I've been at Lace for 18 months. I'm a manager here, also specialise in people and workforce analytics, and helped set up our practice just over a year ago. And before joining Lace, I worked in-house doing various people analytics roles for over a decade, some global roles like head of interim in the British Council, and also the UK public sector. I also like data.
I like data. I love that. That can be your little slogan.
Yeah.
I'm Nancy and I like data. So let's get into the nub of the conversation today, which is around data quality. And in the piece that you wrote, I'll start with you, Becki, if that's all right. We talked about why it's everyone's issue. So can you just give us a bit of a framing as to why people need to be thinking about this, I guess, holistically across the board, not just one team, maybe it's the IT team, whatever it is?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's from mine and Nancy's background. We've always sort of been in those HR analytics teams, and you really can see how it does impact everybody. It's not just that one team's responsibility to resolve it. Ultimately, everyone's got a role to play in it. It affects everybody. If you're an employee at a company, if your time worked information is incorrect, it can affect your pay. It's just got a real knock-on effect of what poor quality can do. If your learning record isn't up to date, it might limit your access to systems. If your bank account details, well, nobody wants that dreaded thing of not being paid correctly or not being paid on time. So really, it does have such a kind of wide-ranging impact across everybody in the business. And obviously the way that can manifest itself, or the way that whose responsibility it is to ultimately make those changes, depends on lots of different factors in the organisation. But it's so wide-ranging, the impact it can have, that it really is something everybody should be thinking about. And people have much more ownership of their personal data now than they ever really have before. Things like GDPR, ever since that came in, freedom of information requests, subject access requests, people have got much more ownership and entitlement to their data than they did. So it really just kind of shows that importance that people should have about making sure the information held on them is correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Nancy?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think there's also that sort of broader impact around just poor decisions being made if all of these entry-level mistakes or inaccuracies of data just sort of aggregate up. So if a business is making decisions on gut feel or inaccurate, incomplete data, then that can impact anyone at an organisation, either at an individual level or just potentially even a business's profitability as well. For example, if an organisation doesn't have high quality EDI data, it might not develop the right inclusion strategies for the business. If you're hiring and your skill data isn't accurate, then that might impact your workforce planning. You might end up with talent shortages, or you might overhire, which could then mean that you need to go into a kind of redundancy process, which could have been avoidable. And I think kind of beyond that, externally, an organisation could face significant compliance risks or fail to meet mandatory external reporting commitments. So that could be the new ESRS reporting, it could be gender pay gap or FOIs that Becki was saying as well.
I wanted to ask you both, in regards to your previous roles that you've worked in when you've worked in-house, I'm quite interested in this idea of silos, or almost it being seen within an organisation that it's just the responsibility of one team type thing. Have you kind of seen that, maybe not within the businesses you've worked in, but with peers that you've spoken across in the industry? Because if you work in an analytics team, is there a danger of almost businesses looking and saying, well, you're the analytics guys, so surely it's your responsibility to almost have that oversight? Just want to get some thoughts from you both on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's probably quite common. It's definitely been my experience. And as you said, some of the experience that some of my peers have shared with me. I think when you're in an analytics team, there tends to be a kind of, and Nancy and I have both already adhered to the stereotype, but we like data. You tend to have those people who are interested in the detail, have good attention to detail. So you tend to get people who they will enjoy doing that, or they will see it as part of their role anyway. And I think it kind of depends a little bit on your operating model, I suppose, as well, and your setup. I've been based in shared services and kind of centrally within sort of COEs as well. So it depends, I suppose, where you report into and where you're based across the HR function. But I think ultimately there can be a lot of time wasted sometimes in those teams in doing that piece of work to actually clean up some of that data. Really, the benefit of having an analytics team is absolutely using their data analytics skills to really dig into the data in a bit more detail, provide some insights, maybe visualize it in a nice way, helping the business get those strategic decisions. The time is not as well spent cleaning that data and having to go through it, filtering spreadsheets, however you're doing, whatever processes you've got in place. And if there's system admin teams, sometimes those are in place in shared services as well, and they might play a role within that. But again, typically the same sort of skills. I think it's really about, when previous experience of it is really helping the wider business and the wider HR function and everyone who is impacted by it, helping them really see what the issues are, how much time it's taking up by the centralised teams, and actually how that responsibility could be shared a bit more fairly across everybody. What messaging could we be putting out there to employees themselves to go in and check that data themselves if they're able to self-serve within the system? So I think it definitely is something we've probably both experienced in the past, and it is all about giving people that understanding of why it's so important and actually the benefits of sharing that responsibility across everyone.
Nat, from your perspective, you have similar experiences to that, this idea of I can add a lot of value by having a more consultative approach as opposed to just this cleaning side.
Yeah, and I think both from our experiences in-house and then I think also just through working with clients, a lot of analytics teams spend far more time than they should on data maintenance, data reporting, but it's not that it doesn't need to be done, but it doesn't need to be done by them. There's that kind of maybe mindset within HR that, well, this is data, so it goes over here. Mm-hmm. Whereas the message that I would not always successfully try and push back to stakeholders would be that I don't necessarily know that the data is wrong. I'm just reporting on it or I'm trying to draw insights from it. So I don't know what the right answer is if you're telling me this is wrong. So you need to assign the right data owners and have that kind of framework. And that's something I see as the responsibility of a people analytics team to actually kind of establish the framework and the ways of working, but not to necessarily police everything that sits underneath it. That has to be a broader group.
Yeah, and that's one of the next questions that we had when we were talking about this beforehand, the whole who is actually impacted by people data, because you've just both given an example. I'll start with you, Nancy. You've just both given an example about how the people analytics team can be impacted by this issue, but perhaps put a little bit more colour around the impact it has for other teams and other functions as well.
I suppose starting at the employee level, then I think Becki alluded to some of the issues earlier, like someone might not be paid correctly, they might not be given the right training opportunities or career development opportunities. If, for example, skill data isn't in there, managers might not have the best insights to manage their teams, looking at things like, I don't know who's ready for promotion, looking at engagement data or understanding who might be demotivated. I think finance is another stakeholder that will come up again and again in this area. I think with finance, you're never going to get a perfect data match between finance and HR, but you need to understand where each area is coming from and reach an understanding. And that can't happen if your data is inaccurate. There is, I'm going to contradict myself slightly, and I think finance will often be operating with an imperfect data set, but then I think HR is probably fighting a lot harder for credibility a lot of the time. So can sometimes be held to a bit of a higher standard, which is a challenge in itself. And there is something around educating stakeholders around perfect being the enemy of the good a little bit as well. But that doesn't mean that everyone shouldn't be getting into really good data hygiene practices as well. And then I guess there's also a huge credibility problem with the function if your data is just not seen as reliable, and that will just mean that you can be doing the best analytics and insight provision that you possibly can be, but if there's this perception that your numbers are all wrong and none of it is going to stick.
Yeah. Becki, from your perspective?
Yeah, I agree with everything Nancy said. I think there's definitely other teams across the business that can be hugely impacted by it. Thinking sort of about some of my past experience working for things like local governments and local councils and higher education, where you're kind of answerable to a higher power in a sense, or a kind of external body as well. If you're governed or you receive funding from those areas, I think they have a huge stake in it as well. And I think if you're reporting poor data or incorrect data back to them, that can have huge knock-on impacts, whether it's to do with fines or audits, anything like that, anything where they are trying to gain a sort of national data set. If you're providing information that doesn't match up to that or isn't equal to what everyone else is providing, that's going to have huge knock-on impacts. But I don't want to oversell sort of the importance of it, but kind of how certain, strategies within wider government might be undertaken if they've not got the right data from everybody or equal data. Nancy talked about gender pay gap as well. That's another one that companies are, is a mandatory requirement in this country for companies to provide data on. And that has huge impact on how the media tell the story of what's going on. So that for that data to be correct and everybody to be providing the correct data as they have it, that's hugely important, because that will drive kind of initiatives that happen outside in the wider world.
Can I ask a quick question, just draw on your previous experiences, because you talked about different types of data sets there, payroll, skills, pay gap stuff, things like that. From your previous lives, or again, from when you've just been at conferences and spoken to other companies, are there any particular types of data set that organisations find it more difficult, or they get bigger challenges when it comes to data and accuracies? Is there a particular pattern that ever emerges of certain types of data, or is it just more wide-ranging?
I think with HR data, you can sort of break it down into those different modules you've sort of touched on there. So there's kind of your core data sets about people, there's pay and benefits, there's learning, there's EDI, diversity and inclusion fields as well. I think we can break those down. And I'm sure across different businesses, there's different challenges that come with trying to capture that. It totally depends as well on your setup as well, how you're holding that data and how you're asking people for it. My previous experience has been everything to do with payroll can be quite challenging. There's been quite a lot in the news lately as well around different companies having challenges with payroll. Yeah. Obviously, it's something, we're really keen here at Lace to sort of help businesses work through and understand better. I think that has such a huge knock-on impact on the individual themselves. If you're being paid incorrectly or unfairly, that has such a huge impact on things like retention and employee satisfaction of working somewhere as well. So pay, I think, and benefits has always been something that's quite a challenge to really get right, especially, there's so much legislation around it and so many different policies within businesses. So I think that's an area that's challenging. EDI as well, but I suppose for a different reason, more from a data sensitivity. And that's not necessarily about the quality, but about an element of data gathering, which is encouraging people to provide that information and giving them a really tangible reason as to why it benefits them. Not everybody wants to kind of disclose information like that about themselves. It might be seen sensitive. So I think that's another area that would be hugely beneficial if companies had richer data on it, but often is a challenge to try and capture that from their employees, understandably.
And Nancy, you also had similar kind of experiences around payroll, stuff like that? Or?
Definitely similar. And I think almost in terms of kind of criticality of data, sometimes it's the next level down from payroll, which can be really challenging as well. So people's salary in a payroll system is normally right because people need to be paid correctly. But the stuff that's very important for operational reporting, which maybe if you were responsible for the data entry, it's not as critical as the kind of next category up. That is often the stuff that can fall by the wayside a little bit. So recruitment data is something that organisations struggle with because once someone's in the door, are you kind of tidying up the recruitment record to make sure that everyone's going to be moved to the right stage? Obviously, getting that right is really important for an organisation to understand how they're doing, how they need to change their approach, where they might need to advertise, source from, where they're being successful, how to spend the money. But often you'll just end up with a big backlog of candidates that just haven't been moved to the right place on a recruitment system. And it can be very, very challenging to kind of wade backwards and sort that out.
And it can be really costly for businesses as well. Like I've worked in businesses before where you find people within your database that could potentially be targets, but instead you go out to an external recruitment agency who find the same people, and then all of a sudden you have to pay a big fee, when in fact, if you were able to access your data a little bit easier, then you could have saved yourself. So there's sort of productivity, there's efficiency gains and issues as well, isn't there? I wanted to talk about the importance of leaders driving that message that everyone is responsible for data as well. So can I just get some thoughts from you guys? Because I can imagine in your previous roles, and certainly when you talk to clients at the moment, you'd probably, I would imagine, stressing that quite heavily, because if there's a general culture that we're all responsible for maintaining the integrity of our data, then it surely has a very positive knock-on effect if you're getting that from leaders, right?
Yeah, definitely. I guess like any message that's important to the business, if you're hearing it from the very top and it being emphasised by your CEO or your C-suite leaders, then I think it really does drive that importance. And I do think that's a change and a shift that we're seeing sort of in the HR leadership landscape particularly. I think historically there's maybe always been a bit of an assumption that HR is not very data-driven, not very strategic, and people in those roles haven't really prioritised data. They've prioritised, the other really vital elements, but paying people on time and, the employee experience, getting people in and into jobs. But I think that we are seeing a move much more now towards a more data-driven set of leaders within this space. And I think that is only going to benefit long term, because that will mean that a lot more businesses are putting more money, resource, time into better systems and better technology. And with that, I think naturally comes a better approach to data quality as well. If you're moving to a self-service solution that has the right checks and the right kind of, I suppose the right checks, but the right sort of processes in place to capture data accurately. So if you've got somebody providing their sort code when they apply for a job and they can only put it in a certain format, that's going to automatically mean that data is much more robust from the get-go. So, and I think we're seeing a real shift, and we're seeing that leaders are prioritising that a lot more than they have historically in the past. And that's going to feed down, as you say, into that culture of it being a priority for the business, it not being a kind of side of desk job that people don't really want to do, it being something that people understand why they need to get their holidays in time or process their leavers on time. And I think that's only going to be a positive change, and it's going to increase more and more.
Yeah, that's it. I want to just build on that point and get your views on what Becki just said. Data-driven leaders. Are you seeing that change? Have you seen a step change in organisations or leaders being better, particularly in the HR space, like getting better at leveraging data to tell stories, evidence their decision makings?
Yeah, I think it is definitely, I wouldn't say just moving in that direction. I think we are there now. Certainly when I first started out, then maybe that was a kind of niche skill set that some leaders have. But now I think it will be very challenging to kind of go into a CPO role and not be expected to have that mindset by, the function, by your peers, by a CEO. And I think part of that leadership role is about encouraging that analytics mindset kind of within your team as well. So again, it's not something that is just left to a people analytics team to kind of feed you with insight. It is more of a kind of symbiotic relationship as well. So, HRBPs should be, they have an ear to the ground in their business. They should know what's strategically important. They should know what our challenge is. And they should be able to kind of articulate that into something that an analytics team can go away and investigate. And it should be kind of that real focus on driving business outcomes as well. And I think that feeds down into data quality in the sense that if you're an HRBP and you're talking through some numbers and some findings with your stakeholders, then you should be able to do that very comprehensively. You should be able to kind of defend any challenges if someone says, that headcount number's wrong, and just being able to kind of confidently have those conversations. And again, I don't think it's always been that way, but I think it would be a massive assumption, but I would struggle to think of an organisation where that wouldn't be important now.
Absolutely. I want to talk specifically about HR data as opposed to other data sets. And I wanted to get both of your view on why HR data and good quality data should matter, or maybe you're a bit biased here because this is kind of the function that we work within, but is there a tendency for organisations to maybe emphasise less on people data compared to other areas such as custom data, things like that? Have you seen a change of late because of this kind of idea that you're getting more data-driven leaders and stuff like that? So maybe if we just go into a bit of a rambling, actually ask them a question. So I think the question I'm trying to ask here is more around the differences that you've seen between HR data and why that's improving compared to customer data as well. As an example, customer data, there's lots of data sets that you get.
Yeah, I think, like you say, it's probably hard for us to have a really holistic view of it because our area of expertise is HR data. But I think, my previous experience working in-house has been you do end up as part of a bit of a data community, which will have scientists, analysts, whoever it is from different roles, but across those different elements of the business. And I do think that developing those communities within an organisation is really beneficial because not only are you sharing those data skills across the business, and it means that people can move in and out of roles, which is another huge benefit in talent sharing across the business, but it does mean you're having those conversations with your peers who work across those other data sets. I've worked in retail, it might be customer data, sales data, and those are often much more vast data sets than a HR data set, but actually you realise the connections between them and you realise the commonalities, and you can then start to link them together and actually make even more meaningful insights from them. So you're not just looking at, if it's in retail, the people that are working in a specific shop and the makeup of those people and how many hours they work and how they're paid. You can start to link that then to the hours that they're working and then how that matches to peak times within the shop and how that then can be automated through till self-service tills and where actually those bodies are needed then on the floor and how that links to what's going to go on in the shop. So I think there probably historically has always been more of a priority on getting that data right because it's felt like the driving force behind a business doing well. But actually what we're now seeing, definitely in my experience and speaking to clients, is this holistic view of it and HR being a part of that community and a part of getting in there in terms of data architecture, structure, whether you've got data warehouse or any of the technology as well centrally from your IT team. Having HR data within that and a part of that is only going to bring huge benefits. And I think we are starting to see, or like as Nancy said, we're probably getting there much quicker than I think we've seen while we were in-house. But I think you're now seeing that real change in mindset, that's becoming as valued a part of the organisation as any other data set.
Nancy, from your side?
Yeah, I think when I was starting out in HR analytics, from an operational business reporting perspective, you'd be lucky to have a couple of people metrics kind of chucked into your reporting packs and, it would be headcount and maybe engagement and it wouldn't have any context. It would just be a flat number. But I think through the kind of collaborative relationships that Becki spoke about, then you can start to arrive at an understanding about how people actually drive workforce and just hone in on that and focus on what matters instead.
Yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. We are almost out of time for today's podcast, which has flown by. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to get any kind of final thoughts from you. If you've got people that are listening into this podcast for the first time or they're regular listeners, of course, check out the blog that we've written, and we're going to produce probably a short video for it as well, just to kind of touch on some of the points that we've talked about today. But any kind of final thoughts from you, Becki, on what HR leaders should be thinking about as they exit this particular podcast today?
I think it's just definitely that they're part of a changing mindset, more broadly speaking, around, for other HR leaders who are thinking that way as well. So make the most of those communities and networks to have those conversations, but make sure that you are, if data is important to you, and whether that means getting good reports or going into a meeting and being confident in the data, make sure that that is a message that you're feeding then down to everybody who works across the business. Don't just go straight to your HR analyst team if you've got one, or straight to the kind of shared services. Make sure that's a message that you're putting out there across the business, that this is important and you understand why it's important, and you really kind of stress that everybody has a role in making good data quality and ensuring that there's great data within the business and the benefits it can have.
Brilliant. Nancy, you get the final Jerry Springer final thought moment.
Yeah, I would say there's always more you can be doing. So start by maybe taking a look at your processes, your systems, what your business challenges are, where there might be misalignments, where there might be kind of common complaints, and go from there. It's one of those things that can seem almost too daunting to sort of touch at first, but there are always ways that you can improve it if you've kind of got the mindset and the drive to do so.
Excellent. Hopefully you've enjoyed this particular podcast today. As I said, we've written a couple of pieces on it, and we've got a couple of content pieces which are on our website, which you can find at lacepartners.co.uk/insights. On behalf of myself, on behalf of Nancy and Becki, thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you, hear you, speak to you. No, we do that on the HR on the Effective podcast. Bye-bye.